good to be together this morning. Thank you, Rachel, for reading of the Word and for your prayer. Thank you, Lee and Tom and Kay for presentation of our hymn this morning. I need to write a couple of words on the board. Tom is serving 3 roles today, so he's ready, I think. Let me. The title of today's lesson is Call to Humility and Hospitality. Humility is a very difficult concept to deal with because it's a tricky one, but we'll do our best to deal with it. Winston Churchill was once asked by someone, said, I'm sure that it's gratifying for you when you give political speeches to have such a large audience come to hear you. And he said, oh yes, it is gratifying until I remember that if I were being hanged, there would be twice as many. President Reagan once said, I've left orders to wake me up always in the event of a national emergency, even if I'm in a cabinet meeting. President Reagan had a tremendous humility that was made very acceptable and didn't come across in a bad way by his humor. He saved many situations by humor. Pride and humility, especially humility, has sort of bad rap in our world, and so we have much to overcome in dealing with it. The 19th century British author Charles Dickens helped us see the ugliness of some kinds or some forms of humility in his novel David Copperfield with his character Uriah Heep. Uriah Heep said this, when I was quite a young boy, I got to know what humbleness did, and I took to it. I ate humble pie with an appetite. People like to be above you, says Father. Keep yourself down. I'm very humble to the present moment, Master Copperfield, but I've got a little power. So that's a version, a distortion of Christian humility that I think causes people, when they hear the term humility, to shy away from it and resist it. In the passage that Rachel read, it's preceded by 6 verses that give the setting of the text that she read. This is the 5th of 7 dinner settings in the Gospel of Luke. Luke seems to enjoy dinner settings, and this is the 5th of them. Jesus is a guest at the home of a Pharisee, and the setting for dinners in those days was not inside the home as it is most of the time in our homes, but is like outside on a patio, that kind of thing. And so when there were these formal dinners, people from off the streets, people from around the village and the city came in to observe and to be spectators at these dinners. And so as Jesus came to this one, a man evidently had heard that he would be there, a man with a form of edema, and came and stood before Jesus. And as the man was standing there, Jesus asked the question at the dinner table. He said, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" And there was complete silence among the dinner guests. And then Jesus healed the man and said to the diners, he said, if your child got stuck in a well on the Sabbath, or your ox fell into a ditch, wouldn't you get it out? And there was no response. There was complete silence. And in what Rachel read, it's preceded by Jesus looking around at the group, and apparently he had seen how people were seeking the best seats at this dinner, and he was speaking to that issue. I think in that situation, Jesus was doing far more than trying to save us from embarrassment at dinners. I think that given the context of all he taught in the Gospels, I think he was trying to move us to humility, call us to humility. In the second part of the reading that Rachel did, he's calling us to hospitality. He spoke of the fact that we often reciprocate with each other in hospitality. And I don't think that in this teaching he was diminishing that. I don't think he would say that's unimportant, because he himself had special friends. He had an inner circle of disciples. He had special women who supported his ministry. And there was a family in Bethany of 3 single people, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And he spent much time in their home. So he had the need as a human being for that kind of solid friendship. But what he's calling to in the matter of hospitality is what I would call hospitality with agape, rendering hospitality to people from whom you don't expect anything in return. He calls us as disciples to very high standards in humility and hospitality. Now, taking the title of the lesson, Call to Humility, Call to Hospitality, it has an implication of what are we being called from? And I'd like to ask a question as we begin this morning. Where are we? What would we call where we are to be called from, being called to humility and hospitality? Where do we begin as humans? What should we call that? Pride? Yes.
Self-centered.
Yes. Arrogance.
Arrogance. Arrogance.
So you gotta get another marker.
And try that one. Sorry.
Any other description of this? Ego. Ego. And what would you say, where do we start with hospitality? Selfish. Takers only. And then we come to what he spoke of in the parable, reciprocity, which is an advance over where we began as human beings, but is calling us to still a higher standard. Now, humility, Christian humility, to the Greco-Roman world seemed a very odd thing. They didn't understand humility. they saw it as sort of a slave mentality. And it's interesting that the Greco-Roman tradition has some overlap with the Christian tradition, the Judeo-Christian tradition, in resisting this thing called hubris. In the Greek tragedies, and even in Aesop's fables, you have the theme of arrogance and hubris, and the fact that what Rachel read in our text is that those who lift themselves up will be taken down. There is a gentleman named Stephen Berglas who works with executives in corporations on this matter of hubris. He spent 25 years on the faculty of Harvard Medical School in the Department of Psychiatry and has done extensive research in the tendency of leaders in all kinds of organizations to become isolated from reality, from the world in which they're dealing. And he works with them in identifying points along the way where that hubris can be reversed. That's a very helpful thing, both at the individual level as well as level of corporation or a business or a university. When you think of an organization like the New York Yankees, the storied baseball franchise, under the leadership of their owner and his family, would you say that there is any possibility of humility in the New York Yankees organization? You wouldn't think so, would you? Well, back in 2009, the New York Yankees won their 27th World Series under the direction or under their skipper, Joe Girardi. My picture after that game was that those guys would be staying in the city that night celebrating. That was my picture of it. And I was really surprised to learn that about 1:30 in the morning the next day, November 5th, Joe Girardi drove out of the city to his home in Westchester. And he passed through, he was driving up the one of the parkways going north, the Hutchinson River Parkway, and came to sobriety checkpoint, and the officer there, Kathleen Cristiano, recognized him and congratulated him on the win. He passed, by the way, he passed. And she told him, she said, Mr. Girardi said, your pitcher, Andy Pettit, just went through about 15 minutes ago, so again, congratulations to you. A little while later, just about 15 minutes later, Joe took a western turn off the Hutchinson River Parkway to what's called Cross County Parkway. He was headed west on cross country. And he noticed in the eastbound lane, a car had rounded a curve at too high a rate of speed and was badly damaged, part of it sitting out on the highway. And in a situation like that, having just won the World Series, what do you think that a guy like Joe Girardi would do? He stopped, and he crossed 6 lanes of traffic on the Cross County Thruway and went over to the car, the woman who was the driver, a young woman from Connecticut, was okay, and he made sure that she got out of the car. He called his wife on his cell phone and had her call 911. I wondered why he did that, and I thought maybe he didn't want his cell phone number to be widely available. But anyway, his wife called, and in just a few minutes, Kathleen Cristiano, the woman who dealt with him at the checkpoint, was there on the scene. Joe Girardi, who had just won the World Series, now in blue jeans and a t-shirt, slipped off. He didn't want any recognition for that. And I've thought about this amazing thing that having just won the World Series the way he did, and having the perception to see this other person in need at this time spoke to me of a great humility, a great groundedness and accurate perception of the situation. And a reporter asked him about this later, and he said, you know, it's a great thing to be able to be a part of baseball. It's so much fun. But he said, this calling of seeing and helping your neighbor in trouble is a much higher calling. That's what I've been called to do. That's what we all have been called to do, he said. And I thought that was a wonderful model. He is a wonderful model of one who is able to work in the world, work in a very high pressure world, and not be of it. In critical situations, he's able to see exactly what's going on and to minister as the need arises. One of the things that we have to consider as we look at Jesus' call to humility and hospitality is asking the question, what are the factors in moving us from where we start as children and adolescents and so forth, and move us to what is desired on the part of Jesus? And I find that one of the most telling examples helping us to understand that dynamic is in another dinner situation in the Gospel of Luke. It's his second dinner situation. You recall that in chapter 7, beginning at verse 36, Jesus talks about this banquet at the home of another Pharisee. Chances are Jesus has spoken at synagogue in that area that day, or has taught in an outdoor setting. And the religious leaders, the Pharisees, were curious about him and wanted to bring him into a dining situation where they could get to know better what was going on with him. Again, this was a setting like we described in the one that Rachel read, where it was outdoors, probably, with a table, and the guests at the dinner lean on their left elbow with their feet away from the table and their faces, their hands toward the table. That was the way they had dinner in those days. And in this setting, a woman comes in as an observer, and she goes behind Jesus where his feet are. And you know the story well, how she begins to weep profusely, and she washes his feet with her tears. She anoints his feet with oil, and she kisses them. And Simon, who was the name of this Pharisee, is thinking in his mind, you know, this guy may be a good teacher, he may be a good preacher, but he's not a prophet, because if he were a prophet, he would know what kind of woman this is. Jesus perceived what he was thinking, showing that he was a prophet. And he said, Simon, he said, I have something to ask you. He said, let's look at this situation where a man, a creditor, makes two loans. One of them of 500 denarii. And a denarii is a day's wages in that time. So he loans out to one person 500 denarii and to another 50 denarii. Now Simon, he said, which one of these? He said neither could pay him back. And so he said, Simon, which one of these would love the creditor more than the other? And Simon said, hands down, it was the one who was owed 500, the one who was forgiven the most. And Jesus said, Simon, that is true. He said, Simon, do you see this woman? From the time I came into your house, you didn't wash my feet, as is the normal custom. You didn't give me the traditional kiss. You didn't provide oil for my head. But ever since this woman has been here, she has been washing my feet. She dried them with her hair. She anointed me with a very expensive ointment, and she continued to kiss my feet. He said, this woman has had her sins forgiven. And then he articulated a very important principle in our relationship to God. The one who is forgiven little loves little. The one who is forgiven much loves much. And so I think one of the key dynamics in moving us from self-centeredness, arrogance, pride, and hubris is the grace of God, the fact that we are forgiven. And as we experience that forgiveness, as we know not just in words, but we receive in our hearts the forgiveness offered, we cannot do enough. We cannot do enough to express our love to God. And so he said, her sins are forgiven, and he spoke to the woman and said, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. I wonder if you have observations about other factors in moving from pride and arrogance to humility, or selfishness, reciprocity on the way to hospitality. Any observations you have?
I just think it's a hard thing to tell the difference between sometimes if you're trying to be humble, but yet you're trying to be confident in your work. So you want to feel like you are okay and pretty good to have this kind of job, but yet you're trying to be humble.
Let's look at Joe Girardi in this context. Would you say that Joe Girardi is a confident man? He is a confident man. You have to be confident to lead the New York Yankees. You have to be confident to deal with the Steinbrenner family. So does confidence exclude humility? It doesn't exclude humility at all. Confidence is a God-given thing, and if it goes in one direction, it becomes hubris. If it becomes overinflated, it does. But Jesus, the most humble man that we know, was of extreme confidence. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father by me. That sounds arrogant, but it's true. He also said that I am meek and lowly of heart, and you will find rest to your soul. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. So I don't think confidence and humility are mutually exclusive. Any other observation that you have?
Yeah,
Doris,
that is,
you were gonna ask
that
this?
is pretty close to that.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
We have our new toy. Who wanted to ask a question? Always on.
I think people tend to use a sense of humor when they're trying to express humility to make it a little bit easier.
Yes.
And I find it interesting that humor starts with H-U-M also. So maybe there's a Latin derivative there between humor and humility.
Yes. The Latin is humus as the dish, the Middle Eastern dish, but it means earth. And so we as humans are earth. We are of the earth. Humility means that it's of the earth, that we recognize our earthiness. And humor has the effect of helping us see very clearly that we are of the earth. And I think that's what President Reagan did so well. I'd like to tell one response that he had to Sam Donaldson, an ABC reporter. And let me preface it by saying that what I'm saying, I intend no political edge on it. So please give me a pass on that. Sam Donaldson asked the president during the recession of the Reagan years, he says, Mr. President, do you feel any responsibility for this recession? And President Reagan said, oh yes, I do. He said, I was a Democrat for many years. So rather than coming back at Sam Donaldson in a hostile way, he used the humor.
I also think it's a very humbling experience to accept our salvation. But I wonder sometimes if people, when we say, yes, I know I'm going to heaven, if they look at us as being arrogant. And it's only by God's grace that we're able to go. So I think that's a very humbling experience that may be misunderstood many times.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah. Anyone else? Jack?
Do I need the mic, Mike?
Go ahead.
I've noticed this a lot in my profession as a surgeon. The training that you go through to achieve what you have to achieve when you have somebody's life in your hands can make you feel very arrogant. And I've always said there's a fine line between humility or self-confidence and arrogance. But I began to realize that it's only because of the gifts that God gave us that we're able to do what we do. And a lot of times we don't realize that. It's a very humbling experience to be humble.
Yes, yes. Let me say in connection with that, a year ago, Kay had back surgery in Centennial Hospital, and Jack was sitting with me. A number of you sat with me at various times, Jack at one point, and my mind was so consumed with what I was dealing with, I could not see a person in need that was in the waiting area. This man was in a wheelchair and his legs were severely disabled, and he was trying to pedal his way in his wheelchair rather than using the wheelchair properly. Dr. Jack saw what I could not see. He was humble enough to see the reality that I could not see that day. Jack went over and he didn't just push the man and leave him somewhere. He trained him in just a minute or two how to operate his wheelchair so that he could navigate.
There's another side to that story.
Okay.
Okay, I almost ran over him with my truck, but I was trying to find a place to park. I could see him crossing the street, and I was hoping that he wouldn't remember me. He was so low to the ground, and I was so high up. I didn't see him.
Well, but still, you were tuned in.
Save the man's life.
Bob?
I'm just reminded of the verse Micah 6:8. He has showed you, O man, or showed you, O person, what you need to do. Do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God.
Yeah, excellent. And that's your mom's favorite
That's Mom's
verse.
favorite
That's your
verse.
mom's favorite verse.